Everyone thought my son's wife adored me. That was the story she told, and she told it so well that it settled into rooms before I did. Her voice always dipped when she said my name, like she was handling something fragile, something precious. At church, she would lean in, squeeze my hand, and smile at people as if I were proof of her goodness. I remember the smell of brewed coffee and lemon cleaner in the fellowship hall, the hum of polite conversation, the way heads nodded before I even spoke. Someone once whispered, "She treats her like her own mother," and Emily didn't correct them. She never had to. I stood there quietly, wondering when love became something that only existed when witnesses were present, when affection needed an audience to survive. My name is Margaret Hale. I am 68 years old, and for most of my life I believed patience was a virtue that solved more problems than it created. I was raised in a time when endurance was praised, when women were told that keeping a family intact mattered more than keeping themselves whole. I married young, buried my husband earlier than I ever expected, and raised my son Daniel with steady devotion, the kind that doesn't ask for credit. Love, to me, always meant staying. It meant absorbing discomfort so others could breathe easier. When Daniel married Emily, I told myself my season had shifted. A good mother steps back. A good mother doesn't compete. A good mother doesn't interfere. I repeated those thoughts so often they stopped sounding like fear and started sounding like wisdom. Moving into their home was framed as temporary, a practical solution everyone agreed on without discussion. No one asked me which room I preferred. The smaller bedroom was simply presented, already made up, already decided, as if choice was an unnecessary step we could all skip. My old dresser didn't fit, so it went into storage. Family photos were rearranged with cheerful efficiency. My husband's picture slid from the mantel to a side shelf, then quietly disappeared. Emily never said no. She never raised her voice. She never argued. She spoke in conclusions. "This works better," she'd say, already moving on to the next task, the next improvement. In public, she was warm and attentive. She posted smiling photos online with captions about gratitude, about family first, about blessings she didn't take for granted. She volunteered at school events, organized meal trains, remembered birthdays, sent thank you cards. People told me I was lucky. They said I'd hit the jackpot with her. I smiled because explaining discomfort without bruises feels pointless, and because no one wants to hear a story that doesn't end cleanly. Behind closed doors, care became precise. Meals arrived measured, timed, adjusted. Portions changed without explanation. "You don't need much these days, Mom," Emily would say, sliding my plate slightly away, her tone light, final, like a nurse correcting a chart. My blood pressure medication ran low more than once. Refills were delayed just enough to make me uneasy, but never enough to justify a scene. It was always an oversight. It was never urgent. My mail came stacked neatly, already opened, sorted into piles I hadn't asked for. Doctor appointments appeared on the calendar without discussion. Conversations were summarized for me before I could finish them. If I tried to clarify something, Emily laughed softly and said, "She gets mixed up sometimes, but it's okay, we're handling it." I learned quickly that correcting her only made me sound defensive, and defensiveness has a way of making people stop listening. Daniel worked long hours. He came home tired, grateful for quiet, eager for normalcy. When I mentioned something gently, carefully, he brushed it off without intending harm. "Don't read into it," he said once. Rubbing his temples like concern was a luxury item he couldn't afford. Another time, late at night in the kitchen. He hesitated longer than usual. The house was still, the refrigerator humming softly. "You're okay though, right?" he asked, already stepping back before I answered, already preparing himself to accept whatever answer made his life easier. I said yes, because watching him struggle with the truth he wasn't ready to face felt crueler than staying quiet. The children watched everything. Children always do. They corrected my stories mid-sentence, took my usual seat without looking up, repeated phrases they didn't fully understand. Not out of malice, but imitation. Respect isn't taught by lectures. It's taught by tone, by posture, by what's allowed to pass without comment. I began to feel smaller without actually shrinking, like furniture people learn to step around without noticing. Useful, present, but easily ignored. Still, I stayed quiet. I told myself I was keeping peace. I told myself I was protecting Daniel. I told myself that silence was maturity, that this was what strong women did. But silence has a way of collecting details. It sharpens the senses. I started noticing patterns the way I once cataloged books, calmly, methodically, without emotion. Dates that didn't align. Bills paid late but explained early. Promises softened into excuses. I noticed how often explanations replaced solutions. How apologies showed up right on time while change never did. I noticed how decisions were always framed as being in my best interest, even when they left me with fewer choices. I noticed how often Emily spoke for me, about me, instead of to me. I didn't confront. I observed. I remembered. I let moments stack quietly in my mind. If this story resonates with you, if you believe elders deserve respect instead of quiet erasure, take a moment to like and subscribe. Stories like this survive because people choose to listen. By the time winter set in, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit before. My silence wasn't protecting the family. It was protecting a version of reality that only worked for everyone else. I stopped offering opinions that were dismissed anyway. I stopped explaining myself. I began choosing carefully when to speak and when not to. I started doing small things for myself again, things no one noticed at first. Emily didn't react. Control often overlooks calm resistance. Daniel stayed busy. The house remained orderly. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. That's the most dangerous part, because when everything looks fine, no one asks questions. But beneath the routines, beneath the polite smiles and scheduled meals, something had already shifted. I didn't know yet what would expose the truth. I only knew it wouldn't arrive loudly. It would be something ordinary, something almost forgettable, the kind of moment people usually dismiss. And when it came, the story everyone believed would no longer be enough to hold. At some point, silence stops feeling like patience and starts feeling like routine. I didn't notice the exact day it happened, only that it had. Mornings moved faster. Evenings felt shorter. Decisions were made before I finished my sentences. Emily didn't rush me. She didn't need to. She had a way of finishing things for me, like she was helping, like she was saving me the trouble. I let it slide because that's what I'd always done. I told myself it was easier not to rock the boat. Daniel had enough on his plate. Work calls, deadlines, those late dinners he apologized for without really looking at me. I didn't want to be another problem in his life, so I adjusted. I always had. It started with small things repeating themselves. The same cup placed slightly out of reach. My pills moved from the counter to a cabinet I needed to ask about. The grocery bags carried past me without the question of what I preferred. Emily began answering for me in conversations, not cutting me off exactly, just stepping in sooner than necessary. She's fine with whatever, she'd say, smiling. Already turning away. Daniel nodded along because it sounded reasonable, and because Emily always sounded sure. Confidence passes for truth when no one challenges it. The kids picked it up faster than I expected. Lily stopped asking if I wanted tea and started telling me when the kettle was already off. Noah reminded me which chair was better for my back, using Emily's words almost exactly. It wasn't disrespect the way people imagine it. It was instruction. Correction. A tone that said I'd been updated to an earlier version of myself. I didn't scold them. They weren't being cruel. They were repeating what they heard, the way kids do. I remembered Daniel at that age, parroting phrases without knowing what they meant. That memory alone kept my mouth shut. Emily liked order. That's what she called it. Schedules taped inside cabinets. Labels on containers I'd used for years without trouble. She framed it as care, as organization, as efficiency. It's just easier this way, she'd say. And she was right. It was easier. Easier for her. Easier for the house. Easier for Daniel, who hated tension more than anything. I watched him relax when Emily took control of a room. I saw how peace settled on his shoulders like relief. I loved my son enough not to disturb that, even when the peace wasn't meant for me. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped by while Emily was outside on a call. We stood in the doorway talking about nothing important. The weather. The street repairs. When she asked how I was settling in, I answered honestly, softly. Emily came back just then and laughed lightly, the way people do when they correct a child without wanting to embarrass them. Oh, she forgets things, she said, waving it off. We've got a system now. The neighbor nodded politely, but her eyes flicked to me for half a second longer than necessary. Emily didn't notice. Or maybe she did. Either way, the conversation moved on, and so did I. I stopped correcting little inaccuracies, because it never seemed worth the effort. If Emily told Daniel I'd already eaten, I let him believe it. If she said I didn't feel like going out, I stayed home. The truth required energy, and I was learning where my energy mattered and where it didn't. I told myself these were adjustments, not losses. Still, I began noticing how often explanations replaced solutions. How frequently my needs were discussed without my presence. How easily decisions landed once my opinion was removed from the equation. I started remembering things the way I used to catalog books at the library, back when details mattered. Dates. Phrases. The exact words Emily used when she framed something as my choice. The pause Daniel took before agreeing with her. The way the kids watched their mother before reacting to me. I didn't write anything down yet. I didn't need to. My mind had grown quiet enough to hold it all. Silence leaves room for observation if you let it. There was a strange comfort in becoming background noise. No one argued with furniture. No one accused the lamp of being difficult. I moved through the house carefully, not out of fear, but out of awareness. Awareness changes how you stand, how you listen. I noticed Emily's voice sharpen only when Daniel wasn't around. I noticed how quickly it softened when footsteps came down the hall. I noticed how often she said my name when someone else was listening, and how rarely she used it when we were alone. A few days later, I stood at the pharmacy counter while Emily spoke to the clerk beside me, explaining my prescriptions as if I weren't there. The clerk glanced at me once, waiting. Emily kept talking. I said nothing. The receipt slid across the counter toward her, not me. It was a small thing, almost forgettable. But I remembered the feel of the laminate under my fingertips and the way being silent made the transaction smoother for everyone else. Daniel asked once if I was okay. Not really asked. More like checked a box. You're okay though, right? He said, already glancing at his phone. I told him I was fine because that was the truth he needed. He smiled, relieved, and walked away lighter. That was the moment I understood something quietly important. Comfort has weight. Someone always carries it. I didn't feel angry. Anger would have required belief that someone had wronged me on purpose. What I felt was clarity creeping in, slow and steady. This wasn't about misunderstanding. It was about control disguised as care. About love spoken in public and managed in private. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. But I didn't announce it. I didn't confront Emily. I didn't warn Daniel. I stayed exactly where they expected me to be. Because explaining only teaches people how to ignore you better. And I had finally learned the cost of being understood in a house that ran just fine without listening to me. I used to think silence was a habit. Something you grow into with age, like slower steps or softer food. That's what people like to believe about women like me. That we fade gently. That we choose quiet because we're tired. But somewhere between Emily correcting my words in front of others and Daniel avoiding my eyes like they carried blame, I realized silence wasn't something I had learned. It was something I had been trained into. Quietly. Politely. With a smile everyone else trusted. Once that thought settled, I couldn't unsee it. I started noticing how often my voice disappeared before I even finished a sentence. Not because I stopped talking, but because someone always picked up where I left off. Usually Emily. Sometimes Daniel, without meaning to. Almost always with that same tone people use when they think they're helping. The kind that sounds reasonable. The kind no one questions. By then, I wasn't just watching anymore. I was measuring. The way her tone changed depending on who was standing nearby. Sharp and efficient when we were alone. Warm and sweet the second footsteps entered the room. The way the house felt smaller after Daniel left for work, like the walls leaned in a little closer, and how it suddenly became brighter, almost staged, when someone rang the bell. Emily had a way of rearranging the air itself. Conversations felt rehearsed around her. I noticed how often my name was replaced with phrases instead. She's fine. She doesn't mind. She already knows. Funny thing is, I never said I didn't. I just stopped correcting them. Correction, I learned, only teaches people how to ignore you better. She had rules for everything by then. Not rules written down, just expectations that floated in the room until they became law. When I ate. When I rested. Where I sat. Even the pills on the counter were lined up with a precision that felt less like care and more like control. If I moved them, she'd sigh. Not loud. Not rude. just enough for the kids to notice. Lily would glance at Emily before reacting to me, like she was checking a cue. Noah copied her tone without even knowing where it came from. That was the part that landed hardest. Not the control. The echo. Children don't create cruelty. They mirror it. And once I saw that, I stopped blaming them entirely. They were learning a system, same as I had. Daniel floated through all of this like a man trying not to spill a full cup. Always careful. Always balancing. He loved me, I know that. But love that avoids discomfort turns into distance fast. Comfort has weight. Someone always carries it. And for years, that someone had been me. One afternoon, Daniel's cousin Mark stopped by without calling first. The kind of visit that throws off routines. Emily switched instantly. Her voice lifted, her smile widened, and suddenly the house felt like a brochure. She offered coffee, laughed too loud, talked about how Grandma keeps herself busy helping around the house. I was wiping the table when I mentioned something small, something harmless, about a family dinner from years ago. She corrected me mid-sentence, right there, casual as anything. That's not how it happened, she said lightly, still smiling at Mark. She forgets sometimes. Mark chuckled, awkward, unsure what to do with that information. He nodded, took a sip of his coffee, and changed the subject. I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger. Not shame. Clarity. I understood then that this wasn't about mistakes or memory. It was positioning. She didn't need to raise her voice to lower me. She just needed witnesses. After that day, I stopped explaining altogether. I let her words sit without resistance. Let her rewrite me out loud. Not because I agreed, but because I wanted to see how far she'd go when no one pushed back. At the pharmacy, when she spoke for me, I watched the clerk's eyebrows lift just a fraction. At the clinic, when she answered questions that weren't hers, I noticed the pause before the nurse typed. Not confrontation. Just hesitation. Small things. But they stacked. Patterns don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves quietly, over time, to people who are patient enough to notice. I started choosing my silence differently. Not shrinking. Preserving. I stopped rushing to prove I was capable. I stopped filling gaps that weren't mine to fill. I saved my energy. I saved my breath. I saved my dignity. Daniel noticed the change before he understood it. He asked if I was tired. If I needed anything. I told him I was fine, and for the first time, the words meant something different. Emily mistook my stillness for surrender. She relaxed. Got bolder. Systems always do when they think they're unchallenged. What she didn't realize was that I had stopped feeding it. I wasn't quiet anymore. I was finished holding up a structure that relied on my compliance to stand. I didn't raise my voice. I raised my awareness. And once you see how a system works, you don't have to fight it. You just have to step back and let it show itself. By the time people around us started noticing the cracks, Emily believed she was winning. That's how these things usually go. Control feels strongest right before it slips. I had stopped offering explanations completely. Not to Daniel, not to the kids, not even to myself. I let conversations pass without correction, let assumptions land where they wanted, and I watched how quickly her confidence turned into carelessness. She began speaking for me in places where silence used to protect her. At the bank, when the clerk asked me directly about an account change and Emily answered, without looking at me, the woman paused. Just a second. Long enough. I'm sorry, she said politely, but I need to hear it from her. Emily laughed it off, waved a hand like it was nothing, but I felt the shift. A small one. Real ones always are. Later, at the insurance office, when forms came back incomplete because signatures didn't match, the agent asked if I needed assistance reviewing decisions I, apparently, didn't remember making. Emily's smile tightened. She explained. I stayed quiet. The more she explained, the more space she took. And the more space she took, the clearer it became who wasn't being allowed any. Daniel started noticing the paperwork pile up on the kitchen counter. Questions he hadn't asked before hovered on his lips. He didn't press yet. He never did. Comfort still mattered too much to him. At home, Emily's tone sharpened when we were alone. She reminded me how much she handled, how confusing things could be at my age, how lucky I was to have someone managing details. She said it softly. Practiced. Like concern. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I let her keep talking. Systems reveal themselves fastest when no one interrupts them. The kids sense the tension without understanding it. Lily started repeating phrases that weren't hers, little warnings wrapped in concern. Noah watched more than he spoke. Children always know when adults are pretending. They just don't know who to believe yet. One afternoon, the school called. Nothing dramatic. Just a routine confirmation. They needed a guardian signature clarification for an after-school activity. Emily answered first, confident as always. The administrator asked to speak with me. Directly. We like to confirm, she said, friendly but firm. Emily handed me the phone with a look that dared me to fumble. I didn't. I answered calmly. Correctly. The pause on the other end told me everything. Later that evening, Emily snapped for the first time without an audience. Not loud. Not explosive. Just irritated enough to drop the mask. She accused me of confusing people, of making things harder than they needed to be. I looked at her and realized something simple and freeing. I didn't need her approval anymore. Daniel walked in halfway through, felt the tension, and did what he always did. He smoothed it over. Changed the subject. Asked about dinner. But his eyes lingered on the counter, on the mail, on the forms he didn't remember signing. That night, after everyone went to bed, he picked one up. Then another. He didn't wake me. He didn't ask questions yet. But the silence in the house felt different. Heavier. Thinking silence, not obedient silence. Emily doubled down after that. Control always does when it senses threat. She scheduled appointments I hadn't requested. She answered calls meant for me. She reminded Daniel how much stress she carried, how tired she was, how ungrateful it felt when people didn't trust her intentions. Daniel listened. He always did. But trust, once cracked, never seals cleanly. A neighbor, Mrs. Carter, stopped me outside one morning. She mentioned a conversation Emily had with her about how hard it was managing me. The words were casual, almost kind. I thanked her and walked inside. That was the moment I knew it had moved beyond our walls. Emily hadn't just taken control. She had narrated it. Public respect versus private reality can't survive daylight for long. I didn't confront her. I didn't warn Daniel. I didn't correct the story. I let it keep playing exactly as she told it. Because stories like that collapse when too many people hear different versions at once. The invitations to explain myself came slowly. A call from the bank. A follow-up from the school. A polite email from the insurance office. Each one addressed to me. Each one asking for confirmation. Emily noticed. She tried to manage it, but systems built on assumption fail under verification. Daniel finally asked, late one night, if I felt overwhelmed. I looked at him and told the truth without emotion. I feel managed, I said. That was all. He didn't respond right away. He didn't need to. The weight had shifted. I went to bed knowing something irreversible had started. Not a fight. A reckoning. Quiet. I had spent years holding up a structure that needed my silence to stand. I had stepped back. And now, piece by piece, it was beginning to show itself. By the time the truth finished unfolding, no one needed me to explain it. That was the strangest part. I had spent so long believing my silence kept the peace, only to realize it had been doing something else entirely. It had been holding everyone else comfortable. Once I stepped back, even slightly, the weight shifted. And when weight shifts, people notice who has been carrying it all along. Daniel started asking questions he had avoided for years. Not accusations. Not confrontations. Just small, careful questions asked too late to stop what was already happening. He reviewed documents. He listened to voicemails. He noticed how often Emily answered for me even when I was sitting right there. One afternoon, he came home earlier than expected and heard her speaking to the insurance agent on speakerphone, explaining my limitations in a voice meant to sound patient. He didn't interrupt. He just stood there, listening. That silence did what no argument ever could. The next day, he went with me to the bank. Not as a rescuer. As a witness. When the clerk addressed me directly and I answered without hesitation, Daniel's shoulders stiffened. Emily tried to joke it away, said I'd been having good days lately. The clerk smiled politely and said, "She seems perfectly clear to me." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cruel. It was factual. Facts have a way of landing harder than anger. At home, Emily unraveled slowly. Not in rage. In defensiveness. She kept explaining even when no one asked. She reminded Daniel of everything she'd done, every sacrifice, every burden she believed she carried alone. He listened, but something had changed. He wasn't soothed anymore. He was paying attention. The kids felt it too. Lily stopped repeating phrases that weren't hers. Noah started asking me questions directly instead of looking to his mother first. Children recalibrate faster than adults when the air clears. One evening, Daniel asked me a question he should have asked years ago. "Were you okay all this time?" I told him the truth gently. "I adjusted," I said. "That's not the same thing." He nodded, eyes lowered, understanding arriving the way it always does, quietly, and far too late to undo the damage. Emily tried once, just once, to provoke a reaction from me. She accused me of turning Daniel against her, of playing helpless, of making her look bad. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't deny it. I just looked at her and said, "I didn't tell anyone anything. I stopped correcting what you showed them." That was the moment she understood. Not defeat. Exposure. Systems like hers can't survive without cooperation. And I had withdrawn mine. The separation wasn't explosive. There were no slam doors, no screaming matches. Just paperwork. Conversations. Consequences. Emily told her version to anyone who would listen, but it sounded thinner each time. People had already seen enough. Public respect. Once cracked, never quite seals again. Daniel apologized. Not with words at first. With presence. With listening. With letting me speak without finishing my sentences. It didn't erase the past, but it changed the future. That was enough. I moved into a smaller place nearby. My own space. My own routines. My own quiet. When people ask now how I survived those years, I tell them something simple. I didn't survive by fighting. I survived by observing. By remembering. By choosing myself without announcement. If you believe elders deserve dignity, not management, your support helps stories like this be heard. Silence isn't weakness. It's only mistaken for it by people who rely on it. I didn't raise my voice. I raised my value. And everything else followed.